Thanks, Kendall.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Does that look okay? Okay, perfect. All right.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm excited and happy to speak to you all about some of the work I've been doing in Hopland and with the Brashares Lab as well. And let's just dive in. So I wanted to start off by talking about why I decided to come to grad school and what kind of drew me to studying wildlife ecology broadly and also studying in California. So I came to grad school thinking I wanted to study community ecology, so how wildlife interact with one another in their ecosystems. And I was especially interested in looking at how these different wildlife communities are responding to different forms of global change. So that includes climate change, habitat degradation, and what I'll talk about a lot in detail, wildfire, which is especially relevant in California, as we've witnessed in recent years. And I've given this presentation in different forms in the past, and one of my favorite things about, I think, community ecology is that, like my favorite movies, it's like an ensemble story where you have different parts of the community interacting, fulfilling different roles, but they're also interacting in different and unique ways in their environments. And this is a picture, or like an assortment of different pictures of wildlife here at Hopland. On the left are two photos I took of just frog and jackrabbit out on site, and on the right are pictures from our camera traps, and they're all just showing different types of species that are using this area. Secondly, I wanted to talk about how normally when we think about ecosystems, or sometimes when we think about ecosystems, we don't consider how humans also play a significant role in influencing some of these relationships between species. And at a very broad context, it's the interactions between these species and humans that creates a sense of stability or resilience to some of these disturbances that we were talking about and that I'm going to talk about today. Yeah, so I'd also like to say that most of the ecosystems on Earth are in some way influenced by humans. And I think wildfire is a really interesting example because if we think about California, I'll talk about this more, but for thousands of years, California has been shaped by the usage of wildfire through land stewardship by indigenous groups. And we see that continue to reverberate through ecosystems today. And so one of my key interests in all of this talk of community ecology is how do we understand how different species are resilient to different disturbances like wildfire, and how do their responses to those specific disturbances affect their relationships with other species? And how does that help inform how we go about conservation in the future by understanding how those species have come to adapt or are able to adapt or not adapt to some of these disturbances. So I'll go over a quick outline for what I plan on talking about today. One, I want to start off by giving us some context about what wildfire regimes are and how they're changing in California. Secondly, I want to talk about why Hopland is such a cool, perfect place to study wildfire and wildlife ecology, and why I think it's like a really good example kind of to set the stage of studying this topic for the rest of California and other parts of the world. And then thirdly, I want to talk about some ongoing work we're doing looking at community assemblages at Hopland after the 2018 river fire. And then lastly, talk specifically about the response of one species in particular, black-tailed deer, and their movement and behavior to that fire, in response to that fire. So yeah, wildfire has been a topic for a long time, wildfire has been on many Californians' minds for most recent years, and fittingly so. If we think about how wildfire regimes are changing in California, it becomes very clear that it's an escalating issue that needs to be addressed on several fronts. So in saying that, we can ask first, what is a fire regime? So A fire regime is how we normally describe the characteristic pattern of wildfire in a certain landscape. And that can come in different definitions, such as like severity, intensity, how hot the fire is, the size of the fire, and the frequency of the fire. And fires played, as I said, a pivotal role in shaping people and landscapes of California. Indigenous groups have used fire as an important stewardship tool, and they continue to. And thousands of years of using fire for management and stewardship has basically made many ecosystems co-evolve with a specific form of fire regime. And continuing those fire regimes are important to make sure that those ecological, wildlife and plant relationships continue to exist. But as I mentioned before, fire is changing in California. So this is a map of fire events from last August 2020, when we had a flurry of different fires pop up across the state. And literally, like from head to toe, there's fires throughout the state. So next I wanted to talk about like why are these fire regimes changing within California? And firstly, I wanted to talk about fire suppression. So I had mentioned before that fire had been an important part of many of these ecosystems, but post European colonization and the removal of many indigenous groups from their ancestral lands, US policy encouraged the maintenance of forests by preventing any and all wildfires from occurring. So a lot of us are probably familiar with like Smokey Bear and his tagline to "Only you can stop wildfires," and that was kind of part of that argument of preventing all wildfires, which is actually counterintuitive for some ecosystems, which require fire to maintain their natural systems. And secondly, especially in California, fire suppression has led to an increase in fuel loads, or the fuel available to burn, so that when a fire does happen, it's much larger and much more severe than it would have been if we had used fire and more frequently to like manage those fuels better. Secondly, urban expansion and land use change are also influencing the patterning of wildfire across the state. There's been a lot of research looking at how the wildland-urban interface, or the areas where urban and wildland spaces meet, influences the frequency of when fires are burning and ignition patterns. And then finally, climate change plays an important role in affecting the patterns of wildfires as well. So if we think about recent droughts in the past years and how that has influenced we call it the frequency of extreme fire weather, or like very hot days or extended periods of hot days or high wind events that make these megafires more possible and more frequent. So I just wanted to quickly go over some of the major news articles that have come out in recent years, talking about the damages, the lives lost, and some of the problems being caused by these recent wildfires. And from these, a lot of solutions have been pitched, including some not always as good as others, including raking forests. But coming out of this, there's been a lot of argument in that the solution to many of California's wildfire issues is better forest management. And our lab group decided to take a focused look at this exclusively and try to see whether or not California's wildfires are actually occurring in forests more than other ecosystems. So
you're on mute.
Sorry, Kendall, that was my fault. Could you just unmute yourself?
Oh, sorry. Did you hear? Okay. Did you hear the slide?
One more time for us, please.
Okay. So this is a project that our group just finished, sorry. looking at how wildfire is distributed across lots of different land cover types in California. So we have California divided into 6 broad categories. And if you can look closely, these are the burn perimeters of fires from the last 20 years. And from this, we were able to generate graphs of the area burned amongst these different habitat types. And some of our key findings kind of contrast some of this notion that just solving forest management and forest fire in California, it's not going to actually solve all of the wildfire issues in California, because a large majority of the fires happening here happen in hardwood, like Oak Woodland, and shrubland areas like Chaparral. And also, if you look at the proportions of like shrubland burning in proportion to the amount of shrubland available, it's much, or not much, but higher than it would be for conifer. So again, I think addressing California's wildfire issues takes looking at ecosystems from looking at a broad range of different types of ecosystems. So I want to use that to transition into why studying wildfire and wildlife ecology at the Hopland Research and Extension Center has been a great unique case study, and I think could be a flagship or like a key study for guiding research in the rest of the state. Oh, and I should mention this is the beginning of the river fire coming into the Hopland Research and Extension Center, July 27th, 2018. So I'll back up just briefly to talk a little bit about Hopland. I think Hannah mentioned a lot of this, so I'll just kind of gloss over it. HREC is part of the UC A&R system, Ag and Natural Resources. It's located 2 hours north of Berkeley. It consists of rangeland, key oak woodland habitat, where sheep are reared, but also there's shared space with a diversity of wildlife species, like this black bear pictured here. I think Hopland's an interesting place to work because it, like other WUIs, is an intersection for both people and wildlife. And as urban expansion continues, more of California will potentially look like Hopland. And under the lens of wildfire management, WUIs play critical roles in how we manage wildfire in these different wildland spaces. And just briefly more into the past of Hopland, there's been extensive research into biodiversity distributions through bioblitzes in the past. Chuck Vaughn has done bird surveys across the property. Bob Lane and Doug Kelt have done small mammal collections, and Scott Stevens has done fire ecology work. And all of these are great resources to look at as we look at how biodiversity is responding into the future. So here's a map of Hopland, or HREC, divided into land cover classes done by our lab alumni, Alex Meckenturf. It's predominantly oak woodland and grassland with some mixes of chaparral shrubland at the very north part, this orange. And I'd characterize Hopland or HREC as a mixed severity landscape with vegetation types of different fire severities and fire regimes. So if we think about chaparral shrubland, normally burns at high severity relatively infrequently, but it's mixed in with oak woodland and grassland, which burns normally more frequently. And it makes for an interesting case study and how to manage these different land cover types as they intermix. So previously, the Brashares Lab initiated a project to look at how black-tailed deer populations could be estimated for CDFW, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And part of this involved deploying a grid of trail cameras across HREC. So the property was divided into hexagonal grids that you can see here. And then in the center of each hexagon, we placed a trail camera to basically take pictures of wildlife that pass the camera. And it allows us to get a sense of the distribution of different species across space. Secondly, in part of that project, in 2016, the Brashares Lab started GPS collaring black-tailed deer to get a sense of how they move across the landscape in conjunction with the cameras in order to better estimate population dynamics. So zooming out and zooming back to the wildfire event, this is the burn perimeter of the river fire. It's much larger than HREC itself, and you can see it burned about half of the property. And that actually creates a really interesting natural experiment for us, just so happened to have half the property burned and half of it unburned. And also knowing that our cameras are divided amongst these different burned and unburned areas as well. So it gives us some good examples to compare how wildlife are doing in burn and unburn. And then just for reference, this is the size of the whole Mendocino complex fire. And at the time, it was the largest wildfire in California history. Since August 2020, last year, it is now number 2. There's an even bigger fire just north up further up in the Mendocino National Forest. And here is a picture. This is Phoebe, Amy, my lab mates, and I going out to look at HREC post-fire. Looked pretty, some parts looked like a moonscape, mostly very high severity areas. This is probably a tree that had already fallen, but burned completely to ash by some high severity patches of fire. This is me in the corner. One sec. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about looking at some of the camera trap data and other biodiversity monitoring data that we're looking at across HREC. So some of the themes I think that are important to keep in mind when we're thinking about how wildlife respond to wildfire. Repeated large high severity fires may have potential negative impacts on wildlife communities. This could be through mortality for some less mobile species, but for many species, this comes indirectly through the dramatic change in vegetation. Oaks are a huge food resource for many species in the system. Acorns come in periodic crops, but provide huge amounts of food for deer, rodents, birds, and also all the species that eat all those species. So they're probably an important base for many of these wildlife species, but frequent high severity fires could cause oak mortality and prevent oak regeneration, and thereby undercutting this resource for all these species. And that could happen, that might not even happen immediately. It might take several years to understand the full effects of this fire on oak survival. Similarly, we don't always know the long-term or lag effects of the fire. And these effects on individual species could go on to rearrange or impact how they interact with other species. So I talked a little bit about our cameras. Again, there's one camera per hexagonal grid to do like a systematic study of wildlife distributions. 36 cameras overall, and we check each camera 4 times a year, which comes out to like every 3 months, and it's a year-round collection of data. So it's really, really cool data source, and it started in 2016, so we have lots of pre-data to pull from. And surprisingly, almost all the cameras survived the fire. And as I mentioned before, 25 cameras are in the 25 cameras are in the burned northern part of the property, and 11 cameras are in the southern unburned part. And something new I wanted to bring into this community assemblage study was looking at how birds and bats are also responding to the fire. So the cameras are used to look at medium to large size mammals. For acoustic monitoring, or for birds, we can use acoustic monitoring, and we are using these audio moth units, which are small little acoustic monitors that you can put out with each camera, and they're recording the bird song of birds that are in at each site. So we're sampling birdsong from March to June. And for birds, we want to capture the dawn chorus, which is when each of these species is singing their characteristic birdsong. And from those bird songs, we can classify the species that are using those areas. And to do this, I've programmed each of the audio moth units to take 5-minute audio snapshots before, during, and after sunrise. So we're doing this for each of the 36 camera grid points and for 4 mornings for each point to get a full sample. And for sampling bats, it's very similar. I think bats are going to be very interesting to look at because they depend heavily on the physical structure of vegetation in their environment to navigate using echolocation. Not a lot of work has been done at looking at how they respond to severe fires in Oak Woodlands yet. So I like to use, or I am using these SM mini bats units, which are ultrasonic recorders, and doing the same sampling period from March till June. And instead of doing mornings, we have 4 nights that each recording unit is deployed. And when a bat flies by and does an ultrasonic call, it triggers the recording in the device. And I did a kind of like a pilot season last summer, and we got 70,000 calls, which I'm trying to clean the data now. And it's probably going to take a little bit, but I'm hoping to do another season this coming spring and summer. So for the cameras, it's pretty straightforward to classify the species. You just look at the picture and then you sort it into whichever species bin it is. For bird and bat data, it's a little different. So for the birds, if you're really good with bird calls, you can listen by ear and classify the species that are in the recording. I'm also investigating the use of auto classification software. So there's like programs like BirdNet where you can load in the audio recording and it'll turn it into a sonogram, like a graph of the sound. And you can use that to classify which species a bird is calling based on an algorithm. Also, there's real potential to use citizen science, since I'm not a pro at bird calls by any means. I think it'd be great to come to the community and try to build a process where we can pull out the recording data and have people identify birds through some kind of method and bring that data together instead. For the bat data, ultrasonic calls are too high frequency for us to hear by ear. So we have to depend on an auto classification software. I'm using Sonobat to classify these species. So similar to birds, it's taking the sound call from the audio file and turning it into a graph, if you can see here. And then each bat has a characteristic frequency and shape to their call, and you can use that to classify. So I'll speak a little bit more about, I'm a little bit further with cleaning and looking at the camera trap data, so I want to spend some time sharing some of that data with you right now. So I think in terms of initial hypotheses on what we may be seeing with some of the mammal community, I predict that high severity areas will probably have lower detections relative to lower severity areas. And I think this will be particularly true for prey species that won't have cover in those high severity areas, or for specialist species who don't have the specific resources that they need in those high severity areas. And then Hopland is also interesting in that we have a record of prescribed burning and grazing across the property that we can also use to look at how these different management tools may have affected fire severity and indirectly affect the distribution of these different wildlife species. And then secondly, in terms of like groups of wildlife species, I predict that large predators will probably be less likely to use some of the burned areas, especially mountain lions who depend on cover for ambushing their prey, which are mostly black-tailed deer. And their absence from these burned areas, I think, will potentially release mesocarnivores. So like small to medium-sized carnivores like bobcats, skunks, and foxes, who do not have to be as weary of these large predators. So I want to share some of the data we're looking at. So in this graph, this is the total number of wildlife detections we've seen on our cameras from 2016 all the way to 2020. And it's just like the total number of any animal sighting on a camera. And this red dotted line is the date of the fire. So overall, I don't know if we can see like a strong effect post-fire, but we do see periodic changes in detection which correlate with season. So I think we get a increase in the number of detections of wildlife species around fall and winter each year. So here I've split up that previous graph into two types of cameras. So this red line follows the number of detections we find on all the burn cameras, so the 25 burn cameras. This blue line follows how many detections have been recorded in all the unburned cameras. So just by virtue of, if we assume that all cameras would get about the same number of pictures, we would expect that because there's 25 burn cameras, we should be getting more detections on those cameras than on unburned cameras. And that's the case up until the fire. Right after the fire, detection numbers decrease. And by 2020, the number of detections for both groups is about equal. One thing I should say though is, so these detection numbers don't correlate to like abundance numbers for different species. It could just be a change in behavior or a change of activity in those areas. And it could also be, if we think about cameras, after the fire, all the vegetation is cleared, so it might be easier just to detect species based on just how the cameras work. And these are things I'm trying to take into account into the models that we'll be using to analyze the data. So this is a very similar graph to the previous one, except I've broken down the detections into the type of species. So each color in a row or a column is corresponding to a different species detected by that camera. And you can see that the large majority of the detections are deer, which something we definitely see on the cameras mostly. Just to make it a little easier to look at, I've taken the deer out so that we can look at the other species that are less commonly seen. And I think so on the left side, we have the cameras that did burn, and on the right side with the cameras that didn't burn. And I think the biggest takeaway that I immediately see is that this olive green species, which is gray squirrel, falls very quickly right after the fire and is yet to come back to the number of detections that we would normally see. And this isn't, we haven't done any of the core analyses on this yet, but this could suggest that gray squirrel and potentially other species do decrease in either activity or number following the fire. So in the next 3 slides, I just wanted to share 3 examples of species that we can follow in terms of detection numbers following fire. The deer, black-tailed deer, follow the general pattern that I talked about before, where it looks like there may be a decrease after the fire. And by recent years, 2020, they're pretty even in terms of how many detections we see of deer in burned and unburned areas. Coyote, very interestingly, has a big spike in the number of detections following the fire, which goes back down, but this could suggest that perhaps coyotes prefer the habitats that were burned immediately following, or it could mean that they're just easier to detect in areas that had recently burned. And then finally, I have the squirrel detections blown up. So you can see there are a lot of squirrels in the burned cameras beforehand, but then afterwards their numbers fall pretty drastically, and have yet to come back to the number of detections we had seen previously. So on this side, I just wanted to share, to analyze some of these data, I'm hoping to use multi-season occupancy modeling, which is just it's a way to look at how these species are distributed by taking into account how we can't always know exactly where each species is, or imperfect detection is what they call it on each camera. And I think Hopland, we have a really good opportunity to leverage pre and post fire camera data, which makes this multi-season, like comparing how the presence of species changes over time. Hopland, or HREC, is a really good case study in doing that, to look at how time plays into that role. And I'm hoping to include canopy cover and burn history in some of these analyses, and also some of the management tools to see how individual species are responding to these different covariates. And I've run the most simplest form of this model, so I would take this with a big grain of salt. But so far, we're seeing that occupancy does greatly increase for coyotes, slightly increases for skunk, and indeed the largest predators' occupancy greatly decreases, at least in the first year after the fire. And in the future, I'd like to look more explicitly at the relationships and diversity of some of these metrics using multi-species occupancy models. I can talk more later if people have questions, but I think Hopland, in terms of the design of the study, I think it could be an important research site to use for comparing how wildlife species are responding in other parts of the state, and potentially using it as a multi-site, analysis one day. Okay, finally, I wanted to talk specifically about how black-tailed deer are responding to this recent wildfire. So why is it important for us to understand how deer in particular have responded to this fire in terms of movement and behavior? Well, I think it's important for us to know what the adaptive capacity of deer are to this mega fire event. Mega fires are much larger than historical fires in California, so it's potentially challenging how and if movement can compensate for such a disturbance. Also, California black-tailed deer do not migrate, so their movement decisions and behaviors at their current home range are very predictive of how successful they're going to be. They can't just move normally to another place if there's an extreme environmental shock. And finally, the movement decisions that those black-tailed deer make is going to directly impact the habitat usage, movements, and decisions of their predators, mountain lions. So all this is to say that the decisions that black-tailed deer will make is going to influence the rest of their ecosystem as well. So how do you catch a deer and get a GPS collar on it? We use clover trapping, or have used clover trapping since 2016 to get GPS collars on black-tailed deer here at Hopland. We normally do this in the summer or early fall, and our collars are programmed to send a GPS location to the web service once an hour, so an hourly fix. And the collars normally last for one year. And we have movement data available before the fire starting in 2017. And we have around 90 deployments. It might be more now, but a lot of data to work with both before and now after the fire. So some of the initial hypotheses with this is that deer will probably use lower severity burn patches in their home ranges over high severity. And this will be due to there being reduced cover from predation and reduced forage in some of the higher severity areas. And I think deer will probably avoid these areas and more preferentially use areas that have some of those resources still. In line with this, I think deer will probably avoid the chaparral areas. As a reminder, when chaparral burns, there is a great reduction in the amount of vegetation structure and cover. So I think they'd avoid these areas for potentially because they may be or feel like they may be more exposed. Oops. And then finally, there's a potential that deer would potentially or preferentially use low to medium severity areas because of the magnet effect, which is this phenomenon where after a wildfire, when vegetation regrows, it's highly nutritious because the wildfire was able to return nutrients back to the soil. So when the vegetation comes back, it has all the nutrients that had been broken down and given back to the soil. So we've started some of this work already. An undergrad in our group who has since graduated, Sammy Krilling, led an honors thesis, which has become a publication on how deer have responded immediately following the fire. And what we found is that deer quickly leave their home ranges as the fire's coming, which makes sense, but they also quickly return. And deer remain faithful to their original home range, but the home range itself doubles in the 5 months following the fire. So this is depicted here. K1 is one of our collared deer. And this blue home range depicts the original home range before the fire. And then post-fire, this is the calculated home range following. And this, we think, might be due to deer potentially compensating for their reduction in food resources or cover following the fire. And then secondly, deer are more likely to use woodland habitat over chaparral following the fire. So I could back up and say that deer originally don't show a strong preference for habitat type. But after the fire, we found that they preferentially choose to be in areas that are wooded and have existing structure, probably for cover or for forage, and choose to less often use more of the chaparral exposed areas. And I think all this is goes in to say that deer are using some of these behavioral changes to buffer some of the negative effects of wildfire, and potentially using this as a form of adaptive capacity, at least in the short term, until things are able to recover. So that previous work has looked at the first 5 months following the fire, but I would like to continue that and look at how deer are responding over longer periods of time, specifically looking at how after a year or more, whether or not deer are able to go back to using their pre-fire movement behaviors or conditions. And I'd like to do this using, it's called a resource selection function. I can describe it really quickly, but basically it's using, on this graph, all these red dots are confirmed GPS points for each deer, and each blue dot is a randomly generated point. And we can use the comparison of points that they did use and didn't use to understand different landscape features that they're actually selecting for. So something I'm interested in here is whether or not deer avoid areas of high soil severity or areas of low canopy height, which might be correlated to avoiding predation risk or choosing areas that do have forage. And then finally, we can look at even finer scale movement decisions by using, it's called hidden Markov models, which basically is just, you take the, it's basically the track of the deer. You can take that and put it on top of different covariates. So over here we have soil severity. You can imagine looking at how the deer changes, how it moves across different burn patterns or burn severities. So thinking about if the deer makes very direct movements through high severity areas, or does it wander through a little bit more and spend more time foraging in other parts of the property. Jumping from this, the long-term goal of our group has been to simultaneously have both deer, prey, and their predators collared at the same time. And I think it'd be an amazing opportunity to see how predator and prey dynamics shift in some severely burned conditions or converted landscapes. 2 years ago, we spent 6+ months trying to collar mountain lions, but that has not panned out yet. But more recently, we've excitingly been able to get our permit to collar coyotes, and we have had a lot of success already, or at least have 3 coyotes collared across the property. And this is to look at how non-lethal deterrents may affect coyote movement, and how that may be used to manage depredations of sheep. But also, I think it's an important opportunity to see how coyote movements are being affected on the burned landscape, burned and unburned landscape. Coyotes are generalists, so they may not have a strong response to the fire. But if the camera trap data is any indication, there may be a strong preference to some of the burned areas. Sorry. And I think that having the movement data to look at this as well from another angle might help elucidate exactly what coyotes are doing in those areas. And yeah, this just happened yesterday. We got our 3rd coyote, and I was involved in that, and that was very cool. So to bring all these different pieces together, I just want to say that, again, deer are dominant ungulates in these oak woodland ecosystems, so they have profound effects on the structure of food webs, both like above them, how their predators are impacted, and below them, how oaks regenerate and how they forage on different plants that are recovering. So it's difficult to judge the impacts of oak woodlands. It's difficult to judge the impacts on oak woodlands by these fires, because oak woodlands operate on such vast timescales. Oaks may take decades to mature and then reproduce only just when conditions are just right. So because of this, I think it's very important that we're proactive in some of our conservation efforts in these oak woodland landscapes, in protecting them and the wildlife species that are in them. We don't want to miss our window, and we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can proactively before wildfires to make sure that oak woodlands can stay resilient and continue providing for their species. So yeah, I just want to thank the Brashares Lab. Our group has been awesome, and we all work together for all these various projects, and it's been amazing. I'd also like to thank Stevens and Middleton Labs for their guidance, and HREC staff for being so awesome. None of this could have been done without Troy and Allison and their help. And also, I have had the opportunity to work with lots of great research assistants, and they've been out in the field with me and clean data and all of it. So just want to thank them as well. And then finally, thank my Nat Geo early career grant, which has helped me fund the bat monitoring part of this project. So thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Kendall, really the thanks is definitely to you. That was just fabulous. We really appreciate you sharing all that information with us. And I'm seeing questions coming in right now. We have about 10 more minutes. I'm going to suggest that if it's okay with you, Kendall, we may flow over maybe another 5 minutes if folks are able to stay around, because I can already see the questions coming in here.
Yeah.
So the first one I just wanted to check in on, and also I'm going to just ask my colleague Madrona, who's our awesome Grizzly Corps member here. Madrona, if you happen to see any hands up, so if anybody wants to raise their hand using the reactions, go ahead, and Madrona will keep an eye for those. But probably easier for me if you can write your questions in the chat. Thanks, Madrona. So yeah, the first question I had here was somebody who was interested, Valdek was interested in, because they have property that has a lot of squirrels on it, would it be beneficial for them to collect and then relocate squirrels? And we already touched on the fact that relocating wildlife in California is actually illegal. But I'm interested in your view on whether there is any studies on that kind of work.
That's a good question. And I think that's something that we're like specifically on that. I don't know if I've heard that much yet, but I think it's a topic that's going to be talked about more and more as we enter new era of global change, where wildlife species, like the variability of their ability to stay in their original locations, is going to change over time. So yeah, I don't know. At least in Hopland, I can't say for sure exactly whether or not squirrels, like whether or not it was a true squirrel, what's it called, Squirrel-ageddon, or whatever you want to call it. But I mean, that's essentially could be a potential solution. But I think before that, I think it'd be critical to instead try to manage the habitat in the area in a way that makes it so the squirrels in surrounding areas can naturally migrate back in to recolonize those areas. And a lot of work has been done. I think I read this paper about Australia reseeding and replanting a lot of the vegetation that they lost during their recent fires to kind of facilitate the removement of species back into those areas where their habitat was just like completely destroyed. So yeah, I'd say potential solution, but maybe first think about like how to facilitate natural movement first.
Excellent, thank you for that. Then we have a question from Corinne. Are coyotes taking advantage of scavenging opportunities after a fire, and that's why their numbers increase in burned areas? Or is it related to increase in breeding and population size after a catastrophic fire and loss of alpha pairs?
I think it's probably the first former, just because if I go back to that chart, the spike in coyote detections at least happens almost immediately. Like, I don't think it's even a year after. So I don't think it's like an abundance thing where like all of a sudden there's a spike in reproduction because of that. I mean, it could happen like in the lag. And I could definitely see it being like an opportunity to take advantage of either scavenging for animals that were lost in the fire, or an opportunity to take advantage of there being so little cover. You can just like, it might be easier for them to hunt for jackrabbits or whatever squirrels are remaining. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you for that. I wanted just to point out, we had a great message from Stacey Frederick, who pointed out that there are other examples in California of research with pre and post fire data, but this study is unique in just how detailed the wildlife data is to my knowledge. And I just wanted to point out, Kendall, that the work you're doing here is pretty important stuff, and we really appreciate that you've been doing this with the Brashares Lab on this site, and grateful that the fire that came through here provides the opportunities for this as well. Okay, so then I have a message from Alison Smith, who actually works with you, Kendall. Alison's asking, Kendall, in places where you see high oak mortality and regeneration, are you seeing lots of seedling death from small mammals and deer?
Ooh, that's a good, okay. Another good question. So another part of the project that I didn't get to talk about in this presentation is we also have a couple exclosures set up across the property that are basically in the burned area that exclude different groups of animals. So some of them exclude small mammals, some of them exclude deer, some of them exclude both deer and small mammals. And the goal of that project is to see how regeneration is different amongst those different groups. So whether or not small mammals are inhibiting oak regeneration, or if deer are inhibiting oak regeneration. And I've only looked at the first year of that data, or I've only done the first year of that like data collection. So I don't know if I can say for sure, but I am for sure seeing evidence of at least some regeneration of seedlings after the fire and after the fire in some of the burned areas. But I don't know. I think it's going to take time to know their success, and whether or not they'll be able to escape the herbivory pressures of small mammals and deer. That could take decades. So it's definitely a longer time frame. But I think just looking at the like ability for seedlings to actually grow is interesting in itself. And then secondly, oh no, yeah, I think that, does that answer your question? Okay.
I think that was a great answer, and appreciate going into that. And I see the messages keep coming in, so I'm going to try and get through as many as we can in the time that we have. I see Alice said, super interesting talk, thank you. I'm curious about where different animals go during an actual fire, how they make those decisions and individual variation therein. Do you know how far away the deer go while the fire is burning? Local riverine refuge versus run completely away, and which individuals come back first? I know there was a lot in that question, Kendall. Hopefully you can.
Yeah, I think I could answer the deer one pretty well, because we actually, can I share my screen again? I have
Sure, please do.
a cool graphic that could help answer that. Let's see. So let's see if this works. Oh no, do I not have it? Oh, never mind. Okay. Oh no, here it is. So this is a graph showing the deer movements in a time lapse. So right here, you can see they're starting to move a little erratically. This is when the wildfire is coming and they're moving away from their home ranges. So you can see J3 like books it like completely away. But some of them have very smaller, like fine scale movements, probably just avoiding the literal flames. So yeah, the displacement for some of the deer, there's a lot of variability, but in essence, we found that they do come back to their original home range, but expand from that. I guess J3 is probably an outlier in that it like just completely leaves the property. But I don't know, in part of your question, I don't know if there's like a specific place that they're looking for to escape. I think they're just looking to escape the physical fire in any way they can.
And Kendall, am I right in saying that of the collared deer, there were no deer that perished in the fire?
Yeah, no mortalities, yes. Yeah, and then for other species, yeah, I just think we know less about how they're able to move. I think I mentioned that probably the small bodied ones probably aren't able to move as well. So I mean, we did see evidence of like moles and other like fossorial animal, like underground animals, just like dead after the fire. I suspect birds are able to escape pretty easily, but yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks for sharing that. That deer movement was absolutely fascinating. It's the first time I've seen that. I'm actually going to ask, I see Sabrina, one of our colleagues within UCANR, on the call with us as well. Sabrina, I see you have a number of questions here. Would you like to unmute and share those with us? We still can't hear you. Want to just try and unmute one more time? No, unfortunately not. So that's a shame. I'll go through the question that you have. Okay. So Sabrina says, question or comment related to changing wildfire regimes. I work in Southern California, and here we are not seeing less frequent fires due to fire suppression, but more due to increased human-caused ignition. So maybe the comment is that we need to be careful talking about fire regimes in California and note the influence of region in addition to the differences in vegetative cover. Thoughts? And then I'm going to keep moving, Kendall, on this. There's a number of parts of this. Have you considered doing some Sherman or pitfall traps for smaller terrestrial species and also owl pellets? Could be interesting to also compare with bird data split into seed eaters and insectivores. Are you comparing squirrel data and oak mast? And do occupancy models look at changes in habitat quality? In other words, are you using the same habitat types before and after fire? I know there was a lot there in that one question, but any parts of that you want to pull out?
I like pulled up the chat, so I'm going to try to answer them one by one. Yeah, I think your first point is spot on in that the way we talk about fire regimes and management for those fire regimes has to be ecosystem specific. Like for chaparral, did you mention it's less so suppression and more so like the frequency of happening because of their proximity to urban areas, right? For conifer and other hardwood like forests, suppression may be the bigger influence. So yeah, I think, oh, are you here?
Yay, you heard me. Okay. Yeah, honestly, it's a note that I often need to share with my A&R colleagues, but also other fire scientists, that it just might be better to avoid talking about California fire regime as one thing. And then I had been taking questions. I'd been writing them in another document. That's why there's 4 unrelated questions written throughout your talk. Fantastic talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, the next one, the rest of them are more straightforward. Have you or anyone in your group thought about looking at pitfall traps or Sherman traps for small mammals, just other smaller things?
Yeah, so before the fire, we actually tried to do a pilot season of Sherman trapping. And this was going to be like a pre-post prescribed burn small mammal project. But I think we didn't have that much success. And I think it's because we waited too late in the season, like it was very dry, so that we didn't get that many small mammals. And then post fire, I did think about doing it, but yeah, I kind of ran out of hands to use for like cameras, acoustics, and ultrasonics. But I do think, yeah, it's especially about the mesocarnivore population being affected by fire. It'd be very key to know what the small mammals are doing. But I haven't had I need another arm to do that as well.
You need a collaborator.
I think someone else might be doing small mammal stuff here though too. Is that true, Hannah?
Well, I do know that I think we still have on the call that we have Emily Pascoe here, and she's looking specifically at tick research, and so that does connect with small mammal work, but I'm not sure beyond that. And forgive my ignorance, I think John Bailey, our director, is on as well, so if you would like to add anything here.
Sorry, I froze. Okay, hi.
So I am just aware that it's 12:03 now, and I do want to keep time for those who need to get some food or some other call that they have to get to. So feel free if you do need to leave the meeting now. I'm going to just enjoy Kendall's time just for another 5 minutes to finish off and get through the last couple of questions here. And then any that we don't get to now, I will be sending around an email afterwards, and we'll try and cover anything that we couldn't cover that way. So I see, let me just check here. So I see Lasana said, as you see the increase in home range for the deer, do you see a corresponding change in population numbers? And Kendall, just while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to let folks know, I'm just going to launch a poll, which is just our end of webinar poll. If folks get a chance to answer that, that would be wonderful. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think we've looked at that yet, though. I think my lab mate, Janelle Dorsey, and our current postdoc are trying to look at more of the population dynamics stuff. using the camera traps and the movement data. And I didn't mention this, but we also had collected fecal samples of deer, which is interesting because it allows us to look at like identifying individual deer. But I haven't looked at whether or not population numbers have changed in relation to those changes in home range. Yeah, I think we hadn't seen any changes in mortality or like any mortality of our collared deer. We did see evidence of at least temporary decreased body condition, which maybe that comes to indirectly affect how deer are able to reproduce in the following years. But that's a good question. I think that's something that we could definitely look into with the data we have.
Excellent, thank you for that. I then see Emily, so Emily does research on our site too, was asking, has HREC or other nearby burned ranches seen an increase in livestock predation by coyotes or other predators since the fire? It's a really interesting question, and I'd encourage if Alison, who may be on the call, wants to chip in on this as well. Kendall, what do you think?
That's one of my big questions too, like starting this. And I think that's also a question that my lab mate Amy, who's leading a lot of the coyote collaring for us, is interested in as well. And I think at least my initial thought was that after the wildfire, coyote depredation may intensify in some of the areas outside of the burned area, just because, well, I originally thought they wouldn't want to be in the burned area, but that might not be the case. But that was my gut feeling. And I'd be interested to hear if, Alison or John, if you had heard any evidence of that or the opposite. I think that's really interesting.
I wonder if Alison or John are able to unmute and join us for a second.
Yeah, I haven't heard of anything from neighboring ranches, but there's not a lot of people around us that keep sheep anymore either.
What about, I mean, I know they're using like the vineyards as well. I don't know if they any anecdotal evidence of them like seeing coyotes more often after the fire. Maybe there might not be.
Yeah, there's nothing that I've heard. That doesn't mean that it's not true, but nothing I've heard.
That's a whole other study, sounds like to me.
Yeah, great question.
Excellent. So we're just down, I think, to the last question now. Let me see. I see a lot of people just really thanking you for this great work and for the presentation. So here's one that maybe this is, the last question for today. The same question about where different animal species go during the fires. Are your studies able to show animal mortality from the fires themselves, or is this being studied elsewhere in California?
Our work probably can't show whether or not there's mortality, except for like animals that we happen to have collared. And from those animals, we haven't seen any evidence of the fire like directly causing that mortality or any mortality. And I don't know, there are a couple other like fire collared animal movement studies, especially Quentin Martin. He has a few mountain lions collared in Sonoma County that were actually had their collars during the fire that happened in Sonoma, fires that happened in Sonoma, but I don't think there was any evidence of mortality of them either. So, I mean, it must happen, but I do think it's pretty rare, especially for these larger bodied animals that are able to like at least move to some degree away and then recolonize.
Thank you so much for this, Kendall. It's been absolutely fabulous having you speak today. I think one thing it brings up for me is the value of the research which is conducted at this site. And I just want to put a plug in for one of our funds, the Hopland Scholars Donor Fund, which supports folks like Kendall who are researching and considering projects on our site. So that Scholars Fund helps to take away the costs related to using the site for those folks, and also helps our younger scholars from kindergartners all the way through to college students who might be considering things that they're learning on our site. So following this, I will be sending around an email and we'll mention the Hopland Scholars if you'd like to make a donation in there. Kendall, I'm going to wind up now. Again, thank you for giving us all your time today. And thanks to all of you who attended. Look out on our YouTube channel. We'll have a recording of this coming out in a few days' time. And also look out because we'll also be adding to this one with more on our Spotlight on Research webinars in the future. Thanks so much, Kendall, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.